If the cover story of the 75th anniversary edition of the OR&L Review is any indication, Liane Russell's research marked a turning point in genetics. 2 years after the atomic bombs, Liane and her husband Bill Russell moved to Oak Ridge to research the biological impact of nuclear fallout.
And people were quite worried about what the effects might be, not only on themselves, but on their children.
The Russells built a mouse genetics program that came to be known as the Mouse House. They discovered that the Y chromosome is what determines the male sex, and that only one X chromosome is active in female mammals. A historic discovery they weren't even looking for.
The purpose of the program was to get some kind of quantitative information on the hazards, the possible hazards of radiations. So this was not in that line of work.
By the time Liane retired in 2002, her and her husband's research was known across the globe. But some of her proudest contributions came outside of the lab. In June of 1965, a fellow scientist took the Russells to his secret spot on the Obed River, a paddling trip that would change their lives.
But he wasn't going to tell anyone about it because he didn't want it to be overrun or, to be spoiled by other people. But after he got to know us, he decided that we would be all right to people to show it.
The Russells fell in love with the Obed, but a proposed TVA dam threatened to flood the gorge.
So we got very upset by that. And it was just before Christmas, and I hid the paper from Bill so he wouldn't spoil his Christmas.
They bought more than 160 acres along the Obed and created a nonprofit to protect the land. Bill's photographs of the rough and remote terrain helped explain why the land was worth saving. In 1976, after a decade of the Russells and their allies fighting to protect the landscape, Congress placed the Obed Wild and Scenic River under the care of the National Park Service, preserving one of the last free-flowing river systems in the eastern U.S. Even at 95 years old, Liane Russell is not done yet. She continues pushing for clean energy and to minimize global warming while continuing the conservation of cherished landscapes.
I think we need to be very, very careful to keep things beautiful.